Can we have some quiet? This next session is being live streamed again, so if you can let your followers on social media know to go to wsj.com/Europe, where this will be live streamed on our homepage. The next session is Roadmap for a Continent, and we are delighted to have the president of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, to explain how private and public sector can supercharge growth. And he will be interviewed by Martina Stevis again. Please, welcome to the stage. Thank you.
I think the last time I saw you was in DC at the margins of the IMF and World Bank spring meetings last year. And for the last year and a half or so, you've been heading up an institution that is extremely important for the continent of Africa, and I feel is on its way up in that constellation of multilateral financial institutions. And before I even ask you a question, here's something for you to mull, and hopefully our conversation is going to help you answer our poll question, which is, when will the African Development Bank, a homegrown institution, a homegrown development institution, overtake the IMF and the World Bank in significance on the continent? In 5 years, in 10 years, or never? There's something for you. Just give us a little time to talk about it before you make that decision. Tell me about the last year and a half, and tell me, why should the private sector go in with you if they haven't already done so?
Well, first and foremost, we just finished a panel discussion now about private sector. You know, I'm a big private sector person. I don't think that you can have sustainable development unless you really significantly catalyze private sector growth in any economy. And when I take a look at the investments that have been made, especially on infrastructure that we were talking about globally, you will see, you know, in the last, from 2006 to 2016, the total amount was $1.6 trillion from private sector in infrastructure, right? But where it bothers me is the concentration. 56% of that is in Asia, in Europe, and the Pacific. 36% of that is in Latin America, and only less than 10% of that is in Africa. Yet, you take a look at Africa, that's where the huge infrastructure challenge is. You have a continent today that has 645 million people that don't have access to electricity. You can't develop in the dark. It makes absolutely no sense. And so when I became president of African Development Bank, I said the first thing we've got to do is to light up and power Africa. And to light up and power Africa means you've got to have the private sector investing significantly in power. But not just power. You need ports, you need rail, you need transnational highways, you need all those kind of ICT infrastructure. Now, the amount of money you need to do all of that is obviously massive. But I think that the way to look at it is ask the question, why is it not happening? Why has it not been happening? First and foremost, I think, is the fact that the legal and the regulatory environment for private sector investments in infrastructure is quite weak in many parts of Africa. The second is a high level of risk. I mean, whether it's project risk, whether it's market risk, whether it's political risk, it's quite significant. The other one, of course, is you can't finance something that you can't, that's not bankable, right? So the lack of bankable project is a big problem, right, in many of the countries. And even for countries themselves that want to work in PPPs that you mentioned, they don't have the capacity necessarily to even structure complex projects. So sometimes it takes a long time for those projects to be structured. So at the African Development Bank, what have we been doing? 4 things I say we've been doing. First is infrastructure requires affordable financing, you know, cheaper financing. So blended finance is what we do. Because we are a AAA institution, you get access to financing from international capital markets at a good rate, and we can lend it through blended finance to invest in infrastructure. The second one is to de-risk investments, because, you know, guarantees are quite important. So whether it's partial risk guarantees, whether it's partial credit guarantees, for investors to be able to invest significantly in infrastructure. The other one is to support countries to be able, and private sector as well, to be able to develop projects. And so I'll give you some example of some of the things that we've been doing in this area. Let's take the case of power. The largest wind farm in the world, I mean, you live in Kenya, in Africa, is in Kenya. Yep. It's the Lake Turkana windmill, wind farm, which is 300 megawatts, right? It's amazing. We were able to finance that via senior debt, but also provided a lot of partial credit guarantees, risk guarantees for them as they build all the towers so that they get completed on time, and then those that have to uptake the power will be able to get it when they should. The second one is in Morocco. You know, the largest solar concentrated power in the world is in Morocco. It's 500 megawatts. It's called Nu Uzazate. It's $2.7 billion. The bank funded a significant part of that, but also we helped to de-risk that particular investment. In Nigeria, we're talking a lot about Nigeria, where you have, I know Jay and everybody else are here that are working in the power sector, where we supported the Nigerian bulk electricity trader with $180 million to be able to pay off the generating companies and pay off the people supplying gas. You know, geothermal, we're investing heavily in Kenya to help them develop their geothermal capacity. So all of this is just on the power sector. But let's take even the other types of infrastructure, roads, for example. President Macky Sall worked with us to develop a big area of Senegal that's called Diamniadio. It's a big area of about $614 million that, again, we provided blended finance for to be able to do it. You're in Kenya, if you look at the Thika Road, which is the massive road, superhighway, we help to do that. So the bank is invested, right, in infrastructure, power, water, roads, ICT infrastructure, so marine cable network systems to be able to help Africa to develop. So the 5 things that are very important for me, and Jay Allen is here, he sits on my special high-level panel that I set up with Kofi Annan and others, helping us to think through the hi-fi strategy of the bank, is to light up and empower Africa, is to feed Africa, because I come from an agricultural background, and I know it makes no sense to be spending $35 billion a year importing what you should be producing and exporting, right? And if you don't do anything about that, in another, by 2025, Africa will be spending $110 billion importing food. Goodness, I mean, for what reason, right? So that's our second priority, is to help Africa feed itself, become competitive in agriculture, and take agriculture as a business, straight line business. The third is to industrialize Africa. Of course, you can't have that if you don't have power. And so industrializing Africa would mean, instead of selling cocoa beans all the time, it means actually making money from chocolates, because that market for cocoa is highly unstable. It's like this, commodity prices are like that. But I've never seen the price of chocolate go down. The price of chocolate always goes up. I've never seen the price of shirts or nice dresses go down. They always go up, but the price of cotton always goes down. So it makes no sense to be exporting raw materials and complaining that you're poor. You're supposed to be poor for doing the wrong thing. So industrialization is key for Africa. We must industrialize. And also the other one is regional integration, because Africa has to trade with itself. Only 13% today of trade is within the continent. But for that, you need good roads.
You need the roads.
You need ICT networks. You need to have ports working. You need rails working. Those are areas. And finally, for me, the most important of these hi-fi priorities is to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. Actually, a week before I took on my job as president of the African Development Bank, I went to Senegal, to a place called Gorée Island. I don't know how many of you have gone to Gorée Island. But this is a place where they took the slaves, and they throw them into the boats. And I got back into my car, and I said to myself, with all the emotions involved and so on, and I said, well, all these folks went from here against their own will. But today, you've got literally tens of thousands of young Africans that are, of their own will, jumping on rickety boats and going through the Mediterranean, and thousands of them are dead at the bottom of that Mediterranean Sea. Now, that's clearly not the Africa I want. I want an Africa that can create jobs, that can make a lot of young people use their skills well, that can build their entrepreneurship capacity, that can create hope, an Africa where they can stay. And so that's why we are investing as the bank in a massive effort today, It's called Jobs for Africa's Youth. The goal is to help countries to generate 25 million jobs over the next 10 years. And that's going to be in ICT industry, it's going to be in agriculture, and several other smaller medium-sized enterprises. All of that to say, it's been quite an exciting ride. Financially, for the bank, we are stronger than ever before. Last year, we made a total approval of $10.6 billion, which is the highest in the history of the bank. We also had disbursements last year of $6.7 billion, which is also the highest in the history of the bank. So when you talk about whether we'll catch up with others or others catch up with us, I hope they catch up with us.
Well, I'm not going to tell you who told me this anecdote about you, but maybe I'll tell you privately after. But someone told me that when you were agriculture minister in Nigeria, you were trying to convince the president that it was a good idea to stop promoting making bread from other types of flour. Yeah. And he was not convinced. And in your effort to do so, this person told me, you actually started making, was it cassava bread or something like that, and taking it to Goodluck Jonathan's office and trying to make him see that diversification was very important. But that displays a type of attitude of someone who wants to take initiative and doesn't take no for an answer. How are you surviving in a massive bureaucracy? What are your plans to reform the African Development Bank to be the competitive institution it can be and use and leverage its local knowledge, which is, frankly, the only advantage it has over the much wealthier institutions of the Washington Consensus and that are based in DC?
You know, I mean, first, you know, I love the cassava thing because, you know, is
it real?
It's very real, you know, and I can tell you it's the best bread you can have. You know, what people didn't realize at the time was we were spending $5 billion in Nigeria importing wheat. And when God said man shall not live by bread alone, He didn't say they had to eat wheat bread. He just said don't eat bread alone. And that bread can be made from flour. And the thing is that cassava flour, high quality cassava flour, is fantastic for making bread.
I knew I was going to get you to talk about cassava flour instead
of
the AFDB.
And it allowed us today, when I started our policy in Nigeria, you know, people are like, oh my goodness, what in the world is he talking about? But you go to Nigeria today, right? Every single big, from Honeywell to Dangote flour, to all of these guys, are now substituting high-quality cassava flour with wheat to have composite flour for making bread.
Are you going to make cassava bread in the African Development Bank?
No, you see, there is nothing called cassava bread. What you have is a composite flour that you can make also from sorghum. You can mix sorghum with wheat, and you can mix maize with wheat.
I'm going to take this metaphor to a whole new level.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to disrupt a bureaucratic organization with this spirit that you're displaying now?
Maybe I start by giving them cassava bread. But let me tell you what we're doing at the bank. You know, it's a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies are always like that. But you know, people don't eat process, right? Process is not the outcome of development. And so all the processes have to be cut back significantly so that developmental impact can happen faster. You know, I am constantly impatient for development because I think people have waited way too long to have power, to have water. I was telling the folks that I was moderating today that, you know, I said to African heads of state about power, if you want to stay in power, then give power. Because power is the most important thing. It's a fundamental right. There's no way in which you can develop. And so what have we done on reforms of the bank? First and foremost, we have developed a new business model for the bank, development and business model for the bank, which basically is to decentralize the bank. The bank is now decentralized. It's closer to its clients. We've got regional offices in West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, and Southern Africa. And the whole idea is with private sector like you that are there, I want my guys to be close to where the action is, to do the originations from there. They do their portfolio management from there. They monitor and evaluate the impacts of what they do from there. But it's not just money. Influence matters. The African Development Bank is the voice of Africa on development. And the greatest thing we have is not money, it's knowledge. And knowledge is power. And so I want our bank being there constantly with countries to be able to do that. And so that's going very, very well. I did something super crazy when in November 2015, when I came in. I got into the boardroom, and it was the first project I had to approve with our board, and I looked at it, and I looked at the procurement cycle. It was going to be almost 3 years. And it's about a project in a place called West Kordofan in Sudan, where the girls were dropping very fast out of school because the zone is called a zone of thirst. There was no water there. 50% of all the income was spent on water. 80% of the conflict was all on water. And so when I took a look at the project, it was going to take almost 3 years for the procurement cycle. I said, forget it. That's never going to happen, because by that time, all the girls are out of school. And so I signed an executive order. Well, this is a nice, nice presidential directive. Now, the time from our approval of any project to our first disbursement has gone down by 44%, just like that. And so you've got to move things faster for people. I think that's important. The second thing we are doing at the bank for private sector is that, take power, for example. I said that we got to invest $12 billion in the power sector. And we've got to leverage $50 billion from the private sector. Well, we've got to be fit for purpose to do that. And so what we did was we restructured the bank and created a whole new vice presidency complex just on power. And Jay and others that are in power, they know, just on power, Ashish and all the others, and so we are the first and the only multilateral development bank to do that. Why? Because I know without power, Africa is going nowhere. So we've got to restructure ourselves and make it that way. And we also are significantly working to change the DNA of the bank to become more private sector driven. Mm-hmm. You see a lot of that. We have set up a syndications team, because syndication is very important for us. Last year, we did an AB loan, a syndicated loan of $965 million, which is the largest ever in Africa, done for Eskom, the power utility in South Africa. We want to do more of that. And so you're looking at a bank that is leaner, that is faster, that's more efficient, that's more impact-driven, and hopefully you can eat a bit more bread.
On that pitch, you have to answer the poll, 5 years, 10 years, or never. I mean, that's, you did try very hard. Do we have time to maybe take some questions from the audience?
Absolutely. I didn't want to interrupt. It was fascinating. So the poll, let's go in the background. Do we have any questions from the audience here at the side? And then we'll come to you.
Hello, Eivind Fjellstad from the Norwegian African Business Association. President Adesina, we really support your great efforts on energy. But we do have some member companies working in Ghana now, and they have great projects, but they're not allowed to move on because they cannot get a sovereign guarantee because of the deal Ghana have made with IMF. Have you come across this challenge?
Have you what?
Have you come across this challenge?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, if it has to come to financing of power projects, you need to have power purchase agreements. You have to get, gas aggregation agreements and all of that, which quite expensive. So the governments have to give guarantees to the loans that we provide. But I think the most important thing is making sure that it's the right deal. We have partial risk guarantee facilities that we can use to support private sector that are doing that. So if you just private sector and government and you have obligations that the government owe to the private sector, we can de-risk that to the partial risk guarantee facility that I explained earlier. But obviously, if you have countries that are in debt, heavy levels of debt, so there's always the issue about the debt sustainability. And so there's only so much debt stock that you can have. But even more broadly, you find that many African countries that have gone to the international capital market of late to raise a lot of capital. If you look 2006 to 2016, $26 billion raised on international capital markets. 2015 was even $12 billion. Question, how is it being used? If it's being used for consumption, makes no sense. But it's being used to support infrastructure and being done well, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I don't think Africa, in my view, is in a debt crisis at all.
There was another question here. There's probably time for one more. Thank you.
President, you've outlined your plan in different sectors, in infrastructure, in industry, in agriculture. But one key component of the transformational phase of Africa is how well structured the financial services sector is. So what's your plan for the transformation of the financial services sector in Africa so that it can be a powerful funding platform for whatever you want to achieve, be it in infrastructure, in agriculture, and in other areas of activity? Because since the beginning of the discussion today, funding has been at the heart of the transformation of Africa.
Yeah, thanks for the great question. When it comes to financial architecture, market architecture, the big thing is that you're not seeing a lot of monies, the capital markets, and that develop, both in terms of the breadth and depth and the degree of sophistication of the instruments that are being used. And so one of the things that we are doing at the bank is actually helping to connect a lot of the stock exchanges. So the stock exchanges from Casablanca to Nairobi to Cairo and Lagos, we have a project to connect that because obviously that will actually make raising capital a lot easier. The second one has to do with a lot of foreign investors that want to come into Africa and invest in these capital markets. You need some benchmarks for that. And so we have a fund that we have launched that's called the Africa Domestic Bond Fund, which is right now it's $200 million. We're trying to make it $500 million that will invest in those bonds that are African issued, just to give them also the benchmarks and the credibility that's necessary to be able to do that. But when you look at how much money is actually sitting out there in terms of pension funds, in terms of sovereign wealth funds, it's mind-boggling. Well over $360 billion of pension funds. And that's projected to go to almost $1 trillion by 2025. And so question is, how do we use that money to go into power, infrastructure, and so on? And so I think it's very important to work on the legal and regulatory environment to create the asset classes that allows the pension funds to be able to invest. And in our panel today, just before this thing, Chinedu from Nigeria came up with an excellent idea about how we can do co-investment, get the pension funds in early. And so if you have the project preparation facility that develops the project, and then they can sell it off, and they can go in, and they can take the rest of it. But one last point I will make is that Africa is not poor at all. It just happens to have a lot of poor people. The resources are enormous that Africa has. The issue is how those resources are harnessed and used well. Corruption is a big problem. If you look at the amount of illicit capital flows that Africa loses, it loses $60 billion a year in illicit capital flows. Now, the gap for energy financing alone is $30 billion a year. So you end that. You've solved that problem, right? So the worst thing that can happen is for people to be ripping off the assets of the country through corruption. So that's why the bank is very big on programs of transparency, of accountability. We set up something in the bank that we call the African Integrity Fund. So if you have anybody that actually was a contractor that did a bad thing, they are sanctioned, the money goes into that fund that then supports whistleblowing policy and other types of regulatory environment that are there. So I think that's really very important. The other thing I want to just say is, just look at the diaspora, right? I mean, all of us that are Africans that are here in the diaspora, right? It's huge, the amount of diaspora remittances that the continent gets. You look at the United States, all the Africans that are there, they send roughly $9 billion a year. In the UK here, despite Brexit, and all that, they spent quite a lot of money. 8.5% of all the remittances in Africa comes from here. 13% from the United States. So, but question is, we've got to be smarter at securitizing a number of these remittances so that we can use them for big ticket actors. At the end of the day, though, you live and develop not based on the benevolence of others. You've got to have the will. You've got to have the passion, the commitment, and the drive to develop. And I think this generation we live in, we have no choice. We have to leave a better generation. Better assets have to be bequeathed. And I think that keeps me up every single day as president of the African Development Bank. We have to make the high fives happen for Africa. A report was released recently by the UNDP, looking at those high fives that I mentioned to you. And I didn't know they were working on this. And they said, if Africa simply focuses on these high fives, that it will achieve 90% of the Sustainable Development Goals, and will achieve 90% of the Agenda 2063 of Africa. So let's do it. Give the person next to you a high five, and I think that's the way to start.
Thank you very much indeed. So talking of $60 billion